Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listener. Jonathan here. You ready to play a game? It's called word association. That's right. Freud loved it. Kind of built an entire psychotherapy off of it. So if you're not familiar with word association, here's how you play it. I say a word, and you say the first thing that comes to mind. So you can be in your car, the library, on the treadmill at the gym, even in class with your classmates. Just shout it out. It's going to be a good time. Freud thought so. All right, here we go. Recording studio. Composer. Lyricist. Musician. Documentary. So what popped to mind? Well, here's what popped to my mind. And yes, I really did do this exercise. Recording studio, I thought of the word success. Composer, I thought of Beethoven. Lyricist, Stephen Sondheim. Musician, creative. Documentary, Ken Burns. Now, when I think about my words, I think, Beethoven, Sondheim, Burns, these are all creative and successful. They're high status associations. I can tell you what I didn't associate with these words were the words homeless youth. Today's episode of the Social Work Podcast is all about homeless youth who are composers, lyricists, musicians, whose work in a recording studio was the subject of a documentary. My guest is Brian Kelly, Assistant Professor of Social Work at Loyola University Chicago. Brian's insight into the intersection of all these ideas are drawn from his doctoral dissertation, which has one of the most evocative titles of any dissertation I've seen. Superman in the Smallest Space, exploring a music studio for young people experiencing homelessness. And I put the link to the dissertation on the Social Work Podcast website. I spoke with Brian in November of 2013 about the work that he did with these youth in the music studio. We start out our conversation, Brian briefly describes factors that put risk at youth for homelessness, the 3 levels of services that are typically provided to homeless youth, and then we end talking about this innovative way of helping homeless, or some people say housing insecure youth, to develop skills and resources that might protect against future homelessness. This music studio, which was housed in an agency. Now, Brian first told me about his dissertation back in 2012. When he was telling me about this audio documentary, I thought, podcast. I got to get this guy on the podcast. If for no other reason than to hear what these youth were able to create. Apparently, my colleagues from the University at Buffalo's In Social Work podcast series felt the same way because they interviewed Brian as well. And you can hear him talking in more depth in their episode about his research questions, methodology, and results. And that's episode 136 of the In Social Work podcast. I put the link to that on the Social Work podcast website as well. Now, the best part of my interview with Brian and the interview that Peter Sabota did for the University of Buffalo's interview is that Brian plays some clips from the audio documentary. So we all get to hear what these youth were able to do. And it's pretty remarkable. So now, without further ado, on to episode 92 of the Social Work Podcast, Music, Positive Youth Development, and Homelessness, an interview with Brian Kelly. Brian, thanks so much for being here on the Social Work Podcast and talking with us today about homeless youth.
Could you give us a brief description of what the experience is like for homeless youth?
Sure. So in terms of the literature, more often than not, young people experiencing homelessness are framed from what I kind of describe as a risks and consequences perspective. Researchers and authors and writers talk about homeless youth in terms of what leads to them experiencing homelessness in terms of risks. And so these risks are kind of broken into several categories, including populations that are at risk of a disproportionate experience of homelessness. And so some of the big categories there would be LGBTQ youth for a variety of reasons, whether their parents might not accept them or they don't feel welcome at home or in their community, or they might find other groups of LGBTQ and queer homeless youth that they kind of want to roam with. Other kinds of risks that lead to young people experiencing homelessness that show up a lot in the literature would be family conflict. And I actually remember listening to your podcast, number 67, with the National Runaway Switchboard, and the director talked about family conflict and her perspective still being one of kind of the leading causes of young people experiencing homelessness. And that can get broken down in a lot of different ways. It can be abuse, whether it be physical, sexual, emotional, in terms of neglect in the home. And it can also be around pregnancy and just other types of risk factors that young people might experience. So in terms of the consequences in the literature, what authors often write about is this idea of what young people experience once they become homeless and they're on the streets. And so we see a lot of writing about behavioral problems and about physical health problems that young people encounter. And then there's a lot written about the survival crimes that young people might engage in and the consequences of those. So survival sex, petty crimes, petty theft, panhandling, and then oftentimes drug use to cope with the experience of being homeless. That being said, we know that in order to survive homelessness, young people have to have strengths and resiliency.
So that was a nice summary of the risk factors and also some of the strengths of kids. So what's the experience of agencies that are providing services to homeless youth?
It's a great question. So where we're at today is very much influenced by the passing of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act in the mid-'70s, which basically at the time set up basic shelters. And then from there, over the years, we've evolved into a more nuanced system of services, kind of a spectrum of services, and those include basic shelters, transitional living programs, and permanent supportive housing programs for young people experiencing homelessness. Basic shelters provide some of the basic needs for young people experiencing homelessness. Shelter, a place to stay for the night, food, showers, sometimes transportation services. But the thing about those shelters is that they're more often than not only open in the evening. And so young people queue up to get a slot, a space, and then in the daytime, they're kind of, let out into, the city, the rural area, wherever it happens to be, to engage in maybe educational activities or vocational activities. Transitional living programs are a step up from a basic shelter in that they provide kind of an interim housing service. And this is somewhat different than the adult population of homeless people and our understanding of transitional living for homeless adults. But with young people, transitional living programs, young people can stay in those programs for up to 2 years. And so each program has its different tenure in terms of how long young people stay. But in a transitional living program, you're looking at a more sophisticated offering of services. So you might have a nurse practitioner on staff, you might have mental health services on staff, or there's some kind of agreement with a provider in the community. And then the final stage, and there's less of these programs than there are of the transitional living programs and the basic shelters, but there's permanent supportive housing. And at that level, what we're seeing that young people are being offered apartments and leases within the community. And they're not building-based. they're more often scattered site. And so what scattered site means is that young people have an apartment in a larger apartment building and are living in the community, as opposed to something like a transitional living program where they're in a building-based environment and all the young people are living together. We don't know a whole lot about the effectiveness of services. And as you look at basic shelters, transitional living programs, and the permanent supportive housing programs, we know less and less as we move up the chain. So the most studies exist about shelters and their outcomes. Then we have this moderate level of knowing of effectiveness at the transitional living program, and then we know even less about the permanent supportive housing programs.
So the agency that you worked with, what sort of services did they provide and where did they fall in that continuum?
So Teen Living Programs, which is located in Bronzeville in Chicago, is a transitional living program for young people experiencing homelessness. And they invite young people to stay in their transitional living program for up to 2 years. In addition, they also provide linkages to permanent supportive housing. It's a much smaller program and it's run by the agency, but where I spent the bulk of my time was in the transitional living program. But within the agency itself, in terms of the services that they offer a very wide spectrum. They align themselves and subscribe to a positive youth development model. In terms of understanding positive youth development, there's kind of the lingo that we use around it, and then there's actually a holistic model that's kind of written out from the federal government, and then how it's actually implemented at the agency level. The agency really tries to respond to the young person from a biopsychosocial and at times spiritual level as well, if young people are interested in that. And so they have a nurse practitioner on staff, they have clinical case management, and then they have what I would describe, and they describe as more frontline case management, so milieu management, and then there's the more sophisticated level of clinical management. And they also offer supportive services, and the supportive services are broken down into kind of three areas. There's vocational services to help young people obtain employment. These young people are between the ages of 18 to 21. Educational services as well, so helping them finish their GED and maybe then getting them into a community college, or some might decide to go to trade school, and some actually decide they want to go to university as well. And then where I am most interested is there's also recreational services for the young people as well. And if I take a minute, I just want to briefly describe that attention to supportive services evolved directly out of the agency's interest in positive youth development. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the agency went through an organizational shift where they really signed on to positive youth development. And so the development of those supportive services, and those again would be education, vocation, and recreation, is in some ways a direct, I don't want to say causally direct, but a direct result of the agency's subscription to positive youth development.
So you mentioned that this agency focuses on 3 areas, and one of them is recreational programming. And you did a study on a music studio in this agency that homeless youth can work in. How did you get involved in that, and how did you come to do this study?
So, as I mentioned earlier, about 10 years ago, I was working as a clinician at the agency, and I was running harm reduction groups for young people around their substance use. And so harm reduction is this philosophy in addictions where, as opposed to an abstinence-based model, which is where we might suggest that people abstain from any alcohol or drug use, in harm reduction, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get them to look at ways they could decrease the harm that they may be doing to themselves through their drug use and alcohol use. And so, as I mentioned, these young people were between the ages of 18 to 21, and more often than not, were not particularly interested in talking to me about their drug use, which was primarily marijuana at times. And so, more often than not, I would have to walk around the agency and kind of drum up interest and, hey, group's going to start, and they'd go running like, oh, it's the drug guy, run. And one day in particular, I happened to go down into the basement of the agency because there were 2 young men who had been strongly encouraged to come to this group and who had not come, and I was seeking them out. And I walked into the basement, and I saw them in the basement, and they were working on music. And one young man was kind of huddled over this kind of what I would define now in 2013 as an archaic kind of hard drive recorder working on some beat production, and the other young man was in the corner with a mic stand and kind of a makeshift popper stopper, which is something you would put in front of a microphone diaphragm to stop hard consonants like B's and P's and T's. And they were working on music, and I just had this moment where I said, like, wow, there's something happening here, and I'm not really sure what it is, but I know I shouldn't ask them to come to group. I should just kind of stand here and see if they'd be okay if I stay here and watch them and kind of just be in this space. And they were okay with it.
So what did you see, or what did you feel that was different from what you saw upstairs?
Well, I think one thing I'll say is that I'm a musician, and I have a passion for music. And when I was 18 or 19, I know that music helped me in a lot of ways. It helped me be able to communicate and express things that I didn't necessarily know how to do otherwise. And it provided me a sense of community with the people that I made music with. And I grew up in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, and we had a really thriving music scene. And it was a way for us to engage with each other and to be in relationship. And I wouldn't look back and say that I had the astuity, I don't know if that's a word, the astuteness to know that that's what was happening. But I think at my gut level, I knew that they were engaged in a process that was really important to them. I had a hunch that what might be happening for them is that they were, like I was 15 years prior, engaged in a process of expressing something and being in relationship with each other in a way that they might not have been able to if they had come to the harm reduction group. And at the same time, they weren't unaware of what they were doing. They had these existing skills, talents, and strengths that they were engaged in. And from my assessment at the time, they were fostering those and developing them further. And so to pull them out of that space and say, hey, why don't you guys stop this and let's come upstairs and talk about something that you're reluctant to talk about anyways, when they were in a space where they were engaged in something that they had skills and strengths at already, seemed to be important to me not to pull them out of that. In the years that transpired between me leaving there as a clinician and then coming back and getting my Ph.D., the studio developed into a fully functioning music studio space that had a small amount of funding and had space allocation, physical space allocation within the building and the agency. And so when I went back to ask the agency if I could actually do an ethnography in the music studio space, they were very open to it. So having studied youth homelessness for several years in my doctoral coursework, and having this practice experience of knowing that it's not just about risks and consequences, that it's also about strengths and resiliency, I developed a study that tried to get an understanding of the factors and processes that led to the development of the space. And with this question, what I was really trying to do was get a sense of, given the kind of the current financial climate of our country and of Illinois and of Chicago, and how social service agencies tend to be tightening all around, how is it that this agency decided that it wanted to put fiscal support and actual physical space and staffing around a music studio space? And then I also wanted to get an understanding of what young people's experiences were in the studio and kind of the grand ethnographic tradition. And there I was really trying to get a sense of, were there consequences and benefits to the space? And so while I was interested in the strengths perspective, I didn't want to be fully biased and not look at whether or not there might be some consequences for them as well. And then the third question that I really wanted to get a sense of, what was the meaning that they attached to their experiences? With that question, I was really trying to get a deeper understanding of not just observing their experience, but then talking to them about, what does this mean for you?
Okay, so I think we're all curious. What did you find? What processes led to the development of this studio?
Essentially, the agency has an organizational commitment to positive youth development. And through that commitment, they hired a recreational programming specialist. And this person had an interest in music and in many ways became a studio advocate. And so what you have is you have the combination of having a staff member who's invested in this programming, and you have a positive youth development model that allows the voice of young people to be at the table when it comes to program long-term development. And it was the synthesis of those two things that really led to how the studio not only developed, but how it was able to sustain over close to a decade now.
You know, it makes a lot of sense that there was an advocate for the creation of the music studio. And so what were the kids' experiences of having this space?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that all of the young people had a pre-existing relationship with music. What that did in many ways was that it indicated to me that they weren't just necessarily engaging in new activities in the space, that they were able to pull existing interests in. And I found it really fascinating that the agency was willing to respond to young people's previous experiences. So I thought that was really great and aligned amazingly with positive youth development. They also engaged in kind of educational kind of activities in the space. And the very interesting thing to me about that is that it was a reciprocal process. And so when we think about music education, we often think about someone educating a young person around maybe composition, in today's day and age, maybe technical software type things. But what was fascinating to me was that it wasn't just that staff might be, for example, the studio advocate might be training young people on how to use software. The young people were also training the studio advocate on how to use software that they were familiar with. And so there was this dialogue going on about technology and music software and music hardware and development. And then young people also educated each other in terms of training each other in different kind of compositional ideas. One young person might be a stronger lyric writer or lyricist or rapper than another young person, so they would train each other. So when I talk about a reciprocal process, it's very much young people educating staff, staff educating young people, and young people educating each other.
You know, as you're describing it, I'm imagining this community of kids, and they're all listening to music all the time anyway, and I think one of the beautiful things about music is that when different music speaks to different people. So I'm kind of having this image of this studio where you have kids that we might lump together as, oh, these are homeless, but they're not homogenous. And so they have different tastes in music. There are different things that pique their interest. They have different skills. And so what you're saying is that because they had this love of music, they were able to engage with each other, pull from different things, educate staff as well as each other, and kind of have this be a focal point that drew on something that they already came in with.
Absolutely. And what you're describing is this additional theme that I found, which I describe as music appreciation. When we think about services, we often think about outcomes and what are the measurable outcomes. And I'm not necessarily sure that I could measure this quantitatively, but qualitatively what I found was that there was this important process of music appreciation, and what would happen is young people would kind of congregate in the space, and one young person may have a preference for what I'll describe as dusties, older kind of R&B tracks from the late 60s and early 70s, and another young person may have a particular interest in trap beat music, which would be kind of defined as darker, more modern rap. An artist like 50 Cent or Wale might be another artist. And they would have these conversations with each other about music interests, and what would be happening is they would be educating each other as well. And it wasn't just about the music, it was about themselves. They were sharing their life histories with each other. And so what you kind of described as they're non-homogenous, right? But they're also oftentimes maybe a little bit guarded around each other because of their experiences and what they had to do to survive on the streets. And now the studio is allowing them an opportunity to kind of let their guard down a little bit. And it's not just with each other, like with education being reciprocal, appreciation is reciprocal as well. So they're able to do it with staff. And so staff would often describe how these appreciation opportunities allowed them an opportunity to engage with young people in ways they might not have been able to in a one-on-one clinical session or in a one-on-one nurse practitioner session or a one-on-one kind of general case management session.
So we're talking about the young people's experiences in the studio, and I know you brought a couple of clips of the recordings that they did. So let's take a listen to one of those clips now, and then I want you to tell us what's going on right? What we're hearing and what you're learning about them through this clip.
I need some airs and pops retiring. My block is pro, but we should stop the violence. All I hear is sirens.
No, if you know, never know. I'm gonna be alright.
That was an amazing clip. I have to say, it's so crazy to think about the stereotype of the homeless youth, and then to hear that, which I could totally imagine hearing on the radio or in a club, and you imagine, some major production studio somewhere in LA or New York. When you hear that, which I'm sure you've heard a dozen times, if not more, like what does that say to you?
Sure. So this would be at base level an example of music production, which would be another major experience that young people have in the studio. And more specifically, this would be an example of collaboration. So a little bit of context. This is a collaboration between 3 or 4 young people, and over time it whittled down to 2 due to some conflict over the collaboration, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And each of the young people involved had a pre-existing relationship with music. So kind of like we talked about earlier, this idea of young people came in with some skills. And so at times the higher production level you're hearing is indicative of some existing strengths and skills. So when I listen to this track, which is called Never Give Up, what I hear is the young people giving voice to this kind of sense of their experience on the streets and how they were never going to give up. And so now that they're in teen living programs and they're in the studio, they're reflecting on that time, and they're also reminding themselves that they're not going to stop now, that this isn't the end, that they're going to keep going. And in their environment, they experience all kinds of obstacles and challenges, both within TLP, the agency, and outside on the streets, but that's not going to be the end game for them, that they're going to overcome those things. And within the actual collaboration itself, in my observations and then my follow-up interviews with the young people, what I found was that in working through kind of tensions and conflicts that can arise in any kind of collaboration, they were able to develop interpersonal skills around learning how to communicate with each other in assertive and not necessarily confrontational ways, learning how to work through conflict and not necessarily walk away. And I think perhaps most importantly, learning how to lean on each other and understand that I may be a good producer, but I don't know how to sing. And this other young person may not know how to produce, but may be able to sing. And so can we come together and collaborate on something and then work through all of kind of the tensions and kind of conflict that can arise through the collaboration? And I think it's a great example. I mean, you indicated I've heard it dozens of times. I've probably heard it hundreds of times, and it still really kind of resonates with me as this kind of really amazing example of what's possible if we provide kind of avenues for young people to do the kind of work that they're interested in.
The skills that you were just describing that they learned in collaboration seem like exactly the kind of interpersonal skills that any agency would just be salivating at if they could say, yeah, our our clients are learning these. And it sounds like they're really learning them in a very experiential way. You also brought in a clip of independent production. And could you set this up for us? What are we going to hear?
Absolutely. So there'll be two young people that you hear from in this clip. A young man who went by the name Outlaw. That's a pseudonym, obviously. And what we did was we were working on a larger project. It was a co-constructed audio documentary that was kind of a companion piece for the larger ethnographic study. And as we were doing recordings for the audio documentary, one day I brought in a decent microphone and set it up. And he did some freestyling. And so, I just turned on the mic and said, let it rip, and he let it rip. And then in an interview later, Outlaw started talking about some of the challenges that young people face in the studio. And I think he's speaking to a very kind of his own experience, but an experience all the young people had around working independently in the studio. And it was overcoming technical challenges. And in working independently, coming through those technical challenges, much like in collaboration, but in terms of working independently, young people were able to work through some interpersonal skills as well and develop those skills. And as another example of that, as kind of Outlaw's kind of narrative fades out within the clip, you'll hear another young man come in, Theo, and he'll be playing some piano for us. And, I just have to say, as important as it is to demonstrate Theo's skill and proficiency around the piano, in terms of kind of thinking about research and audio documentary as this kind of new way of presenting research, this piano piece for me is just really important because it offers the listener a time to just kind of sit back and reflect and be in the space of the piano and kind of not be so focused on the narrative and just be able to kind of get lost in the moment. And so it's personally a very important piece for me, in that it not only demonstrates his ability to compose and his skills, but it also allows us to really come into his space and be with him for the moment.
And as I think about it, having time to just be, to be reflective, to be in that zone that one can be in when they're just playing, is important for everybody. But I would imagine that if you are expending a lot of energy trying to survive, that is a much more rare space to be in, and so all the more significant.
It's huge. Absolutely. I don't think that we could together understate that importance. And I don't know if the young people always articulated it as such, but staff absolutely knew that. And if we were to go back to that kind of first research question, the processes that led to the development of the space, many of the staff indicated that they felt that it was essential for young people to have that moment and that space to be, because of what you indicated. Absolutely. They do not have the opportunity. When you're moving from shelter to shelter, space to space, you don't get to have that moment. So it's a really beautiful thing that they got to have that within the agency.
All right, let's take a listen.
He gon' let it run and I'ma make your lighters burn. I'ma face the east cause just let it run, Let me just get a good topic on my head and just try to go off of it. Look. Okay, Law gonna do this freestyle. First time, it feel like I'm in a real studio, got the good mic, feel good, it's a beautiful day out here. I'm gonna go like this. Today I got a lot going on. I'm something like the prince just looking for the thorn. Yeah, I got a lot of knowledge, see through the storm. And I'm like unique, way out of your norm. Way out perform is something like a boss. Something how you walk away from chances, just your loss. Yeah, I'm something like Jesus sacrificing, but no nail to the cross. Yeah, and when I'm in the studio spitting these bars, that's just the way that I release my energy, dodging my enemies. These niggas is frenemies. All black everything. The most challenges I have with the studio is learning how to deal with the equipment that I have no knowledge of. I mean, I'm more of a lyricist. I mostly deal with words, and poetry, rapping, laying 16ths, 32s, whole songs, things of that nature. So when it comes to certain equipment like mastering and mixing and cutting and fading,
these are so evocative. They're so intense. I guess it shouldn't be surprising, but the third thing that you talked about doing in this ethnography is understanding the meanings that these young people attached to their experience in the music studio.
Absolutely, yeah. And what we're going to do is we're going to listen to another clip, and I'll give you a little bit of context for that. I think that explains that better than I could. But overall, young people in interviews pretty much reported that the studio in total gives them a chance of opportunity to develop new skills, to connect with staff, to connect with each other, and to connect with themselves. As I indicated earlier, a companion piece to this project was the audio documentary. And I think by allowing the young people to kind of share what the studio meant to them, we'll get a much better sense of the meanings that they attach to their experiences in the studio. So rather than listen to me talk about this for another 2 minutes, I'm going to turn it over to the young people. And so you'll hear from the 4 members of the audio documentary team. You'll hear from first Theo, who was the piano player in the last clip. He'll tell us about his experiences and the meaning he attaches to them. Then we'll hear from a young lady named Smurf, who will share some of her experiences. Finally, we'll hear from Outlaw again, who was the freestyler in the second clip. And then underneath them, we'll hear Marcus. We won't hear him narrating, but we'll hear his original kind of music production.
Since we're not coming back, Brian, thank you so much for your work with these young people, creating this audio documentary and sharing it with us. I think it's phenomenal.
Thank you so much.
One of the most valuable things that I've learned working in this studio space. The teamwork is key. When you're doing a collaboration project, you can't always be the front runner. You have to work together to get it accomplished, or else it won't be the best product that it can be. For me, the greatest thing is being able to form so many positive relationships. It's not always a power struggle. It's, when I can come and collaborate with others to produce a high quality product that many people will enjoy, that's the greatest thing for me, because I'm about pleasing my audience.
It really gives me a place to go and be at peace with myself. It's pretty much like my oasis. It's a place just for me. Even when I'm working with somebody else, I still feel like I have control over everything that goes on. Really, it's like the studio gives me power. It's like I'm Superman in the smallest space. It's a small space, but it feels big. So by me being a small person and I have control over a big place, in my mind, it pretty much makes me feel good. The studio makes me happy.
The greatest thing about the studio is the finished product. After spending all that time working on, brainstorming, critical thinking about what to lay down next, what to add, what type of syntheses, what type of audio, if you're gonna use mono. I just feel like when you get done with all that and you have the final product and you look at what you've been working on and it's done, that's the greatest thing about the studio.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.